We are going to do a reading, but we kind of flipped it around this week because I think there's something that I'm hoping has meaning. So thank you guys. We'll see it in a little bit. If you've not been with us for the last several weeks, we're wrapping up this morning a series from the book of Ruth. It's this very obscure, very short narrative in the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and I highly recommend the podcast if that's something you want to jump into. I think we can make this morning self-inclusive, or we can bring you up to speed just in the single morning, but just know that we're wrapping up a series. Next week we're going to talk about baptism. The week after that we're going to do kind of a vision weekend thing, and then we're going to start the Gospel of John in September. But here's the question I want to ask this morning, and I don't know if it's any good or not. You get to decide, but it definitely errs to the side of maybe me bringing too much of myself this morning, because this is kind of where I've been wrestling for quite a bit now, and it's this question of what if becoming a healthy person it requires learning to function as both an I and a we. And part of what I like about the question is recognizing that we've always wanted to be a place that was safe for you, even if you didn't identify as a Christian, and we totally embrace that. And I think this question is helpful, even if you're not here because of, you've got these God thing figured out, which turns out is nobody in the room. But maybe your point of being here is one of pain with respect to a marriage or a relationship, or school's about to start, or there's a financial thing, or you've got an addiction that you're struggling with. I think God can be in that, but there's also this way of asking the question that goes, what if sometimes we perpetually hurt because we try the same solutions over and over and over again? And you've probably heard Albert Einstein, maybe you've heard of him. But one of his statements was this idea that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and over again and expect a different result. And there's a guy, Joseph Meyer, who's did some thinking around this type of idea, but it deals with maybe sometimes we hurt because we're really good at the I side of things, or we're really good at the we side of things, but we're really terrible at the other one. And so we keep returning to the same plate, the same meal, but we're out of balance. What if to be human, what if to thrive as a human, what if to live within how God designed you and made you, what if to be emotionally, psychologically, mentally well, involves recognizing that part of growing up, and I use that intentionally because it just seems like this is a long road, but it involves understanding that you're made as a valuable individual, and you're a contingent being, which means you're not self-sufficient. And that's not just a spiritual thing, that's a relational thing. Notice, maybe you've made the observation before, even in the Bible, the first thing that was bad was the individualism of Adam, that he was left alone. And so what if becoming whole and healthy in your quest, your growth, involves identifying where are you weak, where are you out of balance, and what would it look like to get more balance there? Here's what I mean by this, is we live, this is, the air we breathe is one of individualism. Whether you study this academically or philosophically, we take something for granted that most humans who have ever lived, they didn't get this luxury. We generally operate on the assumption that as an individual, we are valuable, we matter. And those are important things. In fact, one of my favorite thinkers, Dallas Willard, he was once asked, what makes Jesus such an important historical figure? And he started by saying no other human in history has given as much valuable to the individual person. This is a Jesus, remember, who talks about this God knows the number of hairs on your head. This is the God who knows what you need before you ask, but he still wants to hear you ask. This is a God who would have died for you, even if you were the only one. So we assume this, but are you open to the idea that this can go too far? That it can become narcissistic? That sometimes our loneliness is a direct result of our isolation and our narcissism and our self-referencing everything, seeing life through only the lens of I. So it can be a beautiful thing, but can it also be toxic? And I think the one that's probably for most of us, unless you're an Enneagram 9, is more foreign, is this other piece. You might be somebody who the hard work for you is learning, no, you matter. It's okay to have boundaries. It's okay to take care of yourself. Maybe I'm projecting myself because I don't struggle with that one very much. Probably for most of us, there's this undervaluing of community, of the other, of Jesus did say things like, you find your life when you lose it. That's very foreign to our psyche. There's a guy, David Brooks, if you're looking for a good read, I'd say one of the books that changed the trajectory of my life was a book called The Second Mountain. And I read it during COVID. It was the one that kind of became my compass for that season. And what he identifies is most of us, really all of us, spend the first part of our life climbing what he calls the first mountain. It's the mountain of success. It's where we find a career, and we buy a house, and we enter into relationships, and there's sometimes these cliche things and sometimes these predictable things, but we're building for ourselves a life. But he said what often happens is we get to the top of said mountain, and we're still not satisfied, we're not fulfilled. And part of his reflection is there's a very small percentage of people who identify that there's this other mountain. And I like part of what he's not even necessarily saying like hierarchically one is more important than the other, but that part of what it means to be human is there's this second mountain that our culture doesn't actually promote very well, but it's the mountain of community. It's where we learn that we don't just have a job so that we can buy stuff we want and pay our mortgage and support our family, but we have a job that allows us to it's called vocation, like ways of giving back and serving community, of finding meaning in what we do. It's a mountain of relationship and family and God. And here's really what I'm getting at, is what if Ruth actually brings both of these lenses to the table, and what if it reflects a human experience that has many of the same struggles you and I have, and is itself, because remember, Ruth is also written to an audience who's also trying to work through marriage and finance and career and what's going on in the world and all the same stuff. And what if part of what Ruth is trying to do is tell a story where whole people, healthy people, they have a really healthy sense of the I and a really healthy sense of the we. I mean, think of it this way. So this is permission to blurt things out, but you don't have to. You can think it in your head. Like, can you think or name a famous person? Just first thing that comes to mind, first person. You're really good at the blurting it out part. How about a well-known musician? Who comes to mind? Okay, how about a famous dead person? Okay, how about a famous Bible character? And here would be my question. How many of you, before this series, not even that you didn't know of Ruth, but how many of you would have possibly said Ruth or Boaz or Obed before this series? They're obscure names that even for someone who spent a lifetime studying the scriptures, they're not likely, unless you're like my friend Mikey who has Boaz tattooed on his calf, or there's this special place in your own story, it's not likely that they come front of mind even for a scholar. And my question is, what if that's part of the purpose of the book of Ruth in the Bible? What if part of the story is a nobody from nowhere whose faithfulness largely went unrecognized in her day, but here we are. Let's just go back to the end of Ruth, and if you haven't been in this series and you think the Bible's boring, I'm about to help you build your case, because I'm just going to read the last few verses of Ruth. Actually, Justin got some flack last week about dude, you left out some of the best verses, and I felt guilty when he told me that, because I was like, well, yeah, because I didn't give him those, because there was this thing that I wanted to work on right here. Picking up in 17, the women of the neighborhood gave him a name. We're speaking of this son, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, and Hezron of Ram, and Ram of Abinadab, and Abinadab of Nahshon, and Nahshon of Solomon, and Solomon of Boaz, and Boaz of Obed, and Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. To which, if you don't have any familiarity with the story, you go who cares? But what is the story? Well, there's a woman named Naomi who's married, and in an act of spiritual rebellion, she leaves her native land. They do together. It's clear they're not right with God. They move to a place called Moab. They have sons, 2 of them. Those sons marry Moabite women, which even further reflects how far they've drifted from who they're called to be, these new creation people in the world. The sons, they're never successful in having grandkids. And then for a woman in this culture, the worst happens. Her husband dies, and then each of her 2 sons die, and now she's an older woman In a world where women couldn't get jobs, the only thing she could have possibly done was either get remarried, and that would be impossible, or become a prostitute. But she, in verse 6 of the story, early in the story, it says she decided to return to Israel, which is this larger narrative of she's like refinding her roots. Maybe some of you are relating to that right now. There's this like pulling her back to this faith of her childhood. And the question of the book is, how does God respond to this woman who spent most of her life in rebellion to God? And the answer comes quickly, because God, his grace shows up in the form of this woman, Ruth, who's one of her daughters-in-law, and she is Moabite, but she proves to be this woman of exemplary character. She has grit and moxie, and she says to Naomi, I'm going with you. In fact, I'm going to follow your God, and we're going to Israel together. And after some disagreement, Naomi acquiesces, they go back together, and then they get back in the land, and Ruth isn't sitting around waiting for someone to meet her needs. She says, I'm going to go get some food. She utilizes some of the laws in place to go glean on the edges of the field, and the text says she just so happened to pick the field of a guy named Boaz. Now, it's easy for us when we read the Bible to assume that the majority opinion was faithfulness to God and obeying his voice. Kind of like it's easy for us to assume in colonial America, everybody followed God. What we know in actuality is American church attendance has never been lower than the colonial years. And what we know in actuality as it relates to the book of Ruth is these were dark times. The faithfulness of God's people was very bleak. There were very few of them. And she just happened to go to the field of one of them. A rich guy who was devout and cared deeply about God's story. And Ruth and Boaz get married and they give birth to Obed. That's what we just read about. But who's Ruth? Who's Naomi? Like in their world, who were they? They're nobody. They're literally nobody from nowhere. And yet here we are talking about them. Like, what if part of this story is this God cares deeply about the individual? And sometimes in life, we make a decision to turn back towards God, and it doesn't make us famous. Our faithfulness isn't broadcast. But what if Ruth is a type of what is really the normative figure in the faith story? Just normal people, called by God, acting on God's call, and then what happens? They get swept up in this story that's bigger than them. Like, to my original question, what if part of what it means to be human is we're made to have value, to know that we're deeply loved personally by God? Yes, yes, yes. But also to understand that we're a part of a story and we're not the star. That this is a story about a God who wants to rescue creation and uses the most unlikely people in the most obscure and anonymous ways to do this larger thing that God is doing to build a new creation people. Like, think of the absurdity. Maybe you picked up on it when I read, but Ruth, like, she becomes, what is it, the grandma? Obed, Jesse, David. What would that make her? The great-grandma of David. That's like saying Ruth became a part of the lineage of George Washington. It's huge. It's absurd. One visual I'd have, and it's somewhat ironic that I chose to do this weekend, but I brought with me my blankie. And the older I get, the more of a minimalist I am. Like, you might notice I just have one type of jeans and one pair of shoes, and 6 days a week I wear the same blue shirt. I get one delivered the first of every month, so I've got like 30 of them, but I always have fresh ones for dress-up days. I just like stuff less and less, and my wife has 17,000 blankets in the house. I just need one, and I've claimed this one because when I read my Bible in the morning, I want a warm cup of tea and a blanket on my lap. Sorry if I just lost masculinity points with you. But this one's particularly absurd, isn't it? And the story behind it, as I understand it, is that, so my great-grandma Maddie lived in Helena, and she, what is this stuff called? Is this crocheting or knitting? Crocheting. So she crocheted. But as you can tell, she didn't have much of an eye for color. So, or at least that's my understanding. Maybe that's unkind. So as I understand it, one of my mom's sisters, I don't know, maybe it was you, Mary, was it you? Somebody sent a bunch of yarn off to Grandma Matteo to make her a blanket. And as I know the story, Grandma Matteo decided that she would add a little spice to the color palette. So she went to the store and added some yarn spools. And then somehow it ended up at my house because it's less than designer fare. I don't know. Question. For those of you who crochet, How many spools of wool or of yarn do you suppose make this thing up? Someone's got to know. Come on. 10? 15? 20? Wow, that's quite a range. We should arm wrestle. Because really the question is, like, when you look at this, what do you see? And probably some of you are already several steps ahead. It's a little bit of a, there's a little bit of a, like, predictability going on here. But notice it's bold. Like, is this a blanket? Yes. Is this a bunch of individual yarn that's been put together by some artistic hands? Yes. And then if we were super scientific, which I'm not, could we then like pull apart a single thread and see the fibers? And then if we had a microscope, could we get the fibers under a magnifying glass and see all the layers of science within a single fiber? This is the way the Apostle Paul explored what it means to be the church. He talked about like we're one, yes, but we're a part of this bigger thing. And I wonder if part of what the book of Ruth can help us with is seeing the value of the both there. It's possible that God is leading you in this transition in your own understanding of Him where it's just fundamentally becoming less and less about you. And that's a beautiful mark of maturity. It's difficult. It'll feel less personal for a while, but it's possible. I remember when we planted Harvest in Billings, there was this guy named Bob Strutz who was like 10,000 years old and just loved God and was an old pastor. And he used to say to Vern, the guy I worked for in the early years, he'd say, like, Vern, I hate the music. Just hated it. You know, this rock music. He came from the era of hymns and like just no instruments on the stage. But then he would say, but look at this place, it's full. Like, what is that? It's a guy who's understanding that I'm not just an I, I'm a we. And that's kind of what Ruth is doing. You know, there's this question of like to be or not to be a Christian, and if you're not currently wrestling through it, that means you probably have in the past, because especially in the cultural moment of these last few years, this has come rushing to the surface. I think it's always been there. I think we all have to work through this in our 20s, but it's more present than ever. I remember when we started Narrate, we purposely avoided the word Christian for over a decade, and I still stand by it on some level. Because what we recognize is there's so many associations and they're so messy and cloudy and it's so messed up. And so we just call ourselves followers of Jesus. And I think that worked. But now that conversation is hitting a new level, thanks to caricature of social media and actual experience of people that they're having in their own families of origin and other places, there's these whole conversations. Maybe you're in the middle of one right now. If not, you've probably processed this with somebody that's like, do I even want to call myself a Christian anymore? And I think there's some validity to the question. Probably every one of us has someone in our life right now who would sign off on God, but is no longer in places like this with people like us doing things like this because they're just so messed up over the idea of Christian. And listen, that's completely justifiable. The story is full of brokenness. But what if that's part of what Ruth is trying to draw to the surface? Like Naomi spent most of her life a train wreck. She was way outside the lines of orthodoxy and faithfulness. And God, like her just little response to God's grace. And God comes rushing at her with Boaz and Ruth. Like to be or not to be a Christian, I think one option is to form new vocabulary and another is just to leave and do your own, and here we are. Your own hyper-private Christian thing. And listen, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, like, I've been there. I could rationalize that easy. But what if Ruth challenged us to go, wait a minute? But here's the caveat. God's story is full. It's like God's not ashamed of these parameters because the story is full of them. Let's just go to Matthew and look at the genealogy of Jesus, because my hope is that part of what this Ruth story does is it helps you to even read the genealogy different. Here we go, verse 1. An account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Let's just stop there. Who's Tamar? She's a part of God's story, so she must have been like just a glistening princess, right? Well, what's the story of Tamar? Well, Tamar married one of Judah's sons, and he died before they had kids. And the law says that then the next son has to marry her, and he died. And I lose track of how many died before Judah, who could blame him, goes like, hey, I think she's a black widow. No more sons going to Tamar. Well, Tamar took exception to that because that left her very exposed. And apparently she knew about some of Judah's dark habits. And so one day she heard Judah was coming to town, and she dressed as a prostitute. And Judah lived within his brokenness. He frequented the place where you meet prostitutes. They did the deed. But before that, he didn't have the money on hand, and so she said, I need some collateral, and he gave her his driver's license. Later, this is all happening anonymously, of course. Later, Tamar comes up pregnant. And the word gets back to Judah, and Judah's like, well, she needs to die, because clearly she's an adulterer. And she says, okay, fair enough, but could I tell you who the father is? And it's Judah. But here's what messes with, this is why I can't disassociate from historic Christianity. This story doesn't brush that under the carpet. It like weaves it into the fabric of the whole thing. Now, is it trivializing sin? I don't think so. Is there still accountability? Yes, but notice, like, far from hide from it, this story's front and center. Tamar, a nobody from nowhere with a very embarrassing past, who at some point heard the voice of God, said yes, and here we are 3,000 years later talking about her. And Perez, the father of Hezron, and Hezron, the father of Aram, and Aram, the father of Abinadab, and Abinadab, the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon, the father of Salmon, and Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. Wait, who's Rahab? Well, Rahab was a Gentile woman who lived in Jericho, and when the spies who were coming to settle the land post-Moses, when they went to Jericho, she somehow like caught on to the fact that these were the good guys, and she helped them and assisted them, and then later when Jericho got destroyed in a war, they saved her. So she's a Gentile woman who wasn't raised in Jewish faith, who's a part of the genealogy, and you might have picked up on, is actually the mother of Boaz. Like that's nuts. And Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. So, hold on. So why was Boaz so sympathetic to Ruth, this Moabite woman? Oh, his mother was a mudder. Seinfeld. His own mother. It's kind of like why is Jesus so kind to so many women who are former prostitutes and things like that? Oh, because he spent his whole life being raised by a woman who was who was accused of like sexual deviance. He must have had a strong sympathy for that. Why does Boaz like give so much to this woman? Oh, because he was raised by a woman like that. What if this is a story about nobodies from nowhere, who most of them died not knowing the major role they would play in the tapestry of this new creation people that God is making? Because here's how it ends, this genealogy. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who's called the Messiah. What if part of the unhealth of the late modern evangelical church right now is that we've so individualized faith, and listen, that matters. It matters deeply. But part of it is we've so made it a therapeutic that we've lost sight of the fact that ultimately we're a part of a story that's actually not about us. It's about God. And this God rarely uses the educated and the affluent and those who the rest of culture celebrates. Generally, this God takes nobodies from nowhere who respond faithfully to the voice of God and actually weaves them into this thing he's doing, which is bringing new life and restoration to all of creation. You know, it's possible that you're in this season right now where you're contemplating turning your face towards God, and the challenge there is people like me can overplay what'll happen if you do. Probably God will call you to an obscure life of faithfulness where you just listen to him and maybe change diapers at 9 o'clock on Sunday mornings or whatever, and you go to work with a different set of lenses, but probably there'll never be a statue in your name, and probably no one's ever going to celebrate. Probably you'll never get the attention that even someone like myself or the band gets, and that's its own kind of struggle. Probably you'll be a part of this great hall of faith of people who were just like you, but we get to look back and go, oh, God used people like Ruth and Naomi to make sure that people like us were sitting in Helena, Montana in 2023 exploring a God who loves us and invites us to follow him. Maybe that's where you're at. And maybe you have an even harder work, and that harder work would be, okay, it's no longer about me. It's about me being a part of this bigger story. It's so difficult. And that's why when I got to that, like, okay, so what can we do? Before we're done, I just want to pray that I'm convinced that part of the most edgy thing that we can do in this cultural moment is spend the next few years helping people understand that the Christian faith's not just about them. It's this family of people broken in almost every way, forgiven by God, and called to live out this divine conspiracy where they just show up at the same places of work and in the same neighborhoods and do so with the Spirit of God flowing through them. And so I thought before we jump into communion this morning, I'm going to ask my friend Josh to come up here. You can come up here now. And I'm hoping that it'll have some meaning for you. He's just going to read Hebrews 11, which is this long story of nobodies from nowhere who are famous to us because of their response to the voice of God.
Now faith is the assurance things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith our ancestors received approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was made from things that are not visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain's. Through this he received approval as righteous, God himself giving approval for his gifts. He died, but through his faith he still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken so that he did not experience death, and he was not found, because God had taken him. For it was attested before he was taken away that he had pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God. For whoever would approach him must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith Noah warned by God about events yet unseen. He respected the warning and built an ark to save his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir to the righteousness that is in concordance with faith. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. By faith he stayed for a time in the land that he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him for the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that had its foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith he received power and procreation, even though he was too old and Sarah herself was barren, because he considered himself faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of the heavens, and as innumerable as grains of sand by the seashore. All of these died without having received the promises, but from a distance they saw and greeted them. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on the earth. For people who speak in this way make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, "It is through Isaac that descendants shall be named for you." He considered the fact that God is able to even raise someone from the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked blessings for the future on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions about his burial. By faith, Moses was hidden by his parents for 3 months after his birth because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as if it were dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell you of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fires, escaped the edge of the sword, and won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrections. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release in order to obtain a better resurrection. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about of skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. Yet all of these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better, so that they would not, apart from us, be made perfect. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who, for the sake of the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endureth such hostility against himself from sinners, so that you may not grow weary or lose heart. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.